Ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to you and welcome to our session, Asian Women as the Way Forward. I think it's probably safe to say that all of you have already been here sitting in these seats this morning, listening to a fascinating discussion with Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and Professor Klaus Schwab. Daw Suu perhaps popping a few bubbles, but certainly bringing a realistic and pragmatic argument to the development of Myanmar. And we're very lucky today, we're honoured because we've get to keep Daw Suu for a little bit longer to take part in this discussion today, a very important discussion which has far-reaching implications for the economic development of this entire Asia-Pacific region, the empowerment of women, the economic inclusion of women. And just before we start, I'd just like to give you a little bit of perspective on the position of women in this region. And it was actually from the World Economic Forum who did a global gender gap study, which was published last year. It measured disparity between men and women on 4 measures: education, economic participation, political empowerment, and health and survival. And of the top 20 countries where the gap was the narrowest, there were 2 Asian countries, New Zealand and the Philippines. On the bottom 20, where the gender gap was the largest, there were 7 Asian countries: China, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, India, and Pakistan. Now, a report from the UNDP in 2010 said, and I quote, "In every country across Asia and the Pacific, pervasive gender inequality remains a barrier to economic progress." And they actually quantified that, at least in some form. They said that if the participation rate of women in the workforce in India was the same as the United States, 70%, India's GDP would grow by 4.2%. That is an enormous number when you consider it. Malaysia would grow by 3%. One other number I want to put out as well is from Manpower, the employment group, who say that missed opportunities of employing women across Asia Pacific costs about $90 billion a year in lost GDP. And remember, there is also a chronic shortage of skilled workers in this region. And even if the women do get jobs, they are more likely than not to be paid less than their male counterparts. So today we're going to be looking at how the educational, economic and political empowerment of women, and also of girls too, because it's important that the process starts for girls, for the education of girls, and making them realise that they can too be part of the workforce, how all that can contribute to long-term economic growth in Asia Pacific. Certainly, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi needs no introduction. She's joined by a very distinguished panel of guests here today. And on my immediate left is Rokeya Azal Rahman. She is the president of the Bangladesh Federation of Women Entrepreneurs. She's also a founder of the Women Entrepreneurs Association, a former president of the Bangladesh Employers Association. She's a businesswoman in her own right. She has interests in agribusiness and in media, and she's a former director of the Central Bank of Bangladesh. On Daw Suu's left, I'd like to welcome Helene Gayle, who is the president and CEO of CARE USA. Helene is a former senior manager too at the CDC and also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, CARE is, as you know, one of the world's leading humanitarian organisations, and one of its primary focuses in its fight to eradicate poverty is empowerment through improved basic education and expanding women's economic opportunities. And sitting next to Helene, Jon Fredrik Bakkes, who is the CEO of Telenor, the Norwegian-based telecoms company. It is one of the world's biggest mobile phone companies. Worth pointing out to Jon Fredrik that in that WEF study, the top 4 countries where the gender gap was smallest were all Scandinavian. So I'd now like to ask if I can, Daw Suu, to start off. What we will do is our panellists will make brief opening remarks. We will have a discussion period. I will be asking for questions from the floor a little bit later in the program. And I also have some questions which have been gathered on social media sites as well to put to our panellists. So with that, Dorsu, if I could ask you perhaps to begin proceedings, your thoughts.
When people ask whether women can contribute to economic and political developments in the world, what they can contribute, what I want to ask is, what can we not contribute? And why are we not allowed to contribute? I think that women can contribute in every way, but we're not allowed to. I was listening very carefully to what our moderator was saying, and I was struck by the fact that economic development does not equal the narrowing of the gender gap, because Japan and South Korea are among the Asian countries where the gender gap is broadest. So it's not economic development that brings about a narrowing of the gap. It's obviously cultural values. And I think these are what we have to address if we want to find out why we are not allowed to make the contributions of which we are capable. I was also struck by what our moderator said before we came here, that the political role of women, the political inclusivity of women was greater in the Asia-Pacific than their economic activities would indicate. Now, this is not so in Burma. The women work very hard in Burma. Women are engaged in economic activities. But when it comes to politics, we are very much discriminated against. This is not noticed because people can't see how independent Burmese women are, and they do not think that they are discriminated against on the political front. But if you consider the fact that before the by-elections at the beginning of April, there were only 15 MPs among the over 600 in the National Assembly, you can see that women's role in politics is very restricted in Burma. After the by-elections, we added 13 women, almost double the numbers, but that's still not enough. And I don't know whether you know that there are only 2 women deputy ministers in the whole cabinet. 2 deputy ministers are women, not a single woman minister. So there is gender discrimination in Burma. Even when it comes to education, there is gender discrimination. I mentioned to our young shapers at our session on the 30th that girls have to get better marks than boys in order to get into the medical faculty. I think this is to make sure that they have some men doctors. But still, I think that's discrimination. We shouldn't have discrimination like this. And I understand that in both South Korea and Japan, again, where the gender gap is greatest, the best universities find that girls do better in the entrance examinations. I don't know whether this is reflected in their intake. I do know, I have heard, that as far as the results of the entrance exams are concerned, girls do much better than boys. So it's cultural. The discrimination, the gender gap is a cultural rather than an economic issue. I don't think we can resolve that simply through economic development. In that case, there would be no problems in South Korea or Japan. So I think we need to address cultural issues.
Thank you very much. Interesting your point about political involvement, because I'd like to ask Rokia to speak next, and where Bangladesh obviously has a strong history of women leaders.
Yes, but it is, like ma'am just said, that it was culturally, we were so backward. Women were not allowed to come out of the houses. We were very conservative. They did not have access to mobility. They did not have access to education. Their only work was to stay in the house, cook, and raise children. And then came the national awareness that women are the sleeping giant. If we brought them into economic involvement, the women would do well. And after a national commitment, the government private sector and the NGOs together consolidated their efforts. The government gave free education. It was an affirmative action for girls up to grade 12, and now they're considering up to graduate level. All girls in the rural Bangladesh get free education as compared to boys who get up to grade 5 only. Because a family we found invested in the boys' education and not in the girls. So the government gave this free education for girls. The private sector came up with the government industries, and we had women for the first time access to jobs. We have now 2 million women working in the government sector, and with the money they have, it empowers them immediately. And families who did not want daughters now want daughters, because 3 daughters bring 3 new incomes to the house. That has brought in a change. The NGOs like Grameen Bank, BRAC, and ASHA, they address rural Bangladesh, because 80% of the people of Bangladesh live in rural areas. And rural women were the most downtrodden, the most backward, the most conservative. And that is where they went. They gave them money. The women were uneducated, but with very little money, they could show that they could change their lives. And the change that they brought about was confidence, self-confidence for herself. The money that she brought in, 100% was invested in her family. A man they found would borrow, and he would spend some money for himself and the rest on the family. But a woman would invest 100% of her income into her family, and that brought huge change. And women who did not have a voice, who could not speak, now that they were doing business and they were going to borrow money and then return their borrowings, suddenly became a new woman. She was confident, she was empowered, she could talk, she could explain what she wanted to do. And the family started respecting her. Her husband had new respect for her, her in-laws, her family. The community invited her in decision-making.
Enormous cultural change.
Yes, complete change. And we have 20 million women in the microcredit program. And with these 20 million, if they affect the lives of 5 in a family, then 100 million women get affected in rural Bangladesh. So now if you go to rural Bangladesh, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, people who came to Dhaka, the capital, couldn't see women in their streets. Now you see them everywhere. And rural Bangladesh also, we see a lot of women in rural Bangladesh. And that has also touched upon the social indicators. A survey 2010 shows that fertility and mortality, infant health, mortality has improved, education has improved, the health sectors have improved a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. Helene, obviously empowerment of women is a core issue for CARE.
Right. Yeah, so, CARE as an organization whose main mission is eliminating extreme poverty in the countries in which we work, increasingly over the last few years, we've really focused our work around the belief that by empowering girls and women, you can have the greatest impact on reducing rates of poverty. And, some of it's obvious. Obviously, girls and women bear the greatest brunt of poverty around the world. If you look at any statistic, whether it's health or education, if you look at the number of people who are illiterate, 2/3 of those are girls and women. Over 70% of people living in extreme poverty are girls and women, et cetera, et cetera. So you can go on, and the statistics bear evidence that girls and women bear the greatest brunt of poverty. So just in a numeric sense, if you are to focus on girls and women, you would have the greatest impact on reducing poverty. But the flip side of that is that it's more than just the sheer numbers. If you invest in the life of a girl or woman, you really create a virtuous cycle that goes beyond just that individual. So if a girl is educated, for instance, she is much more likely to be able to space her birth. She gets married later, has fewer children. Her children are going to be more healthy. She's more healthy. She's more likely to send her children to school and get an education. They're more likely to have an income, et cetera. So you really create this virtuous cycle that has huge impact, not just for the girl or for the woman, but for her family, for her community, and ultimately for nations. So, we really believe that if we can create that ripple effect of change by influencing the lives of girls and women, then we have this much broader impact. And as a concrete example, taking an example from Bangladesh, a program that we worked with, which was a wonderful cooperative partnership between CARE, the government of Bangladesh, and USAID, our aid agency. It was a program focused on decreasing malnutrition, which is a major problem throughout many of the countries in this region. And this program showed that if you included a component that focused on empowering women, you reduced the rates of malnutrition by twofold over what a standard malnutrition program would. So the standard program reduced the rate of stunting or malnutrition, but if you included a component of women's empowerment, that decline was double. And it was a tangible impact that simple things like allowing women to have free access and get out of their homes, make decisions about food choices, meet with other women to solve problems, start looking at traditional and cultural practices like child marriages and other things that are detrimental to the lives of girls and women, that you had this really tangible impact of decreasing something that you can measure in a hard outcome. So I think there's more and more data that demonstrate why it's so valuable and why you really get a multiplier effect. And as you said, I think the data show that even if you look at kind of macroeconomic factors, we're losing a lot of productivity by, if you will, leaving 50% of the world's potential on the cutting room floor. We just can't continue to afford it. And I would argue that while, the examples that you gave of Japan and Korea, where they are they have strong economies, but what would those economies look like if you added women into the equation? There would be that huge boost. And so I think that's the message, is not that, yes, the economies are growing, but they could grow so much better. The world could be much better if we added that 50% in, whose potential is right now not being able to be accessed by the greater world. And we could go on and on about the statistics, whether it's peace and stability, whether it's corruption, and the role that having more women in political life does for issues like corruption, good governance, peace and stability. So I think, the bottom line is, if you invest in girls and women, you have a huge ripple effect that has changes for whole societies.
Was it Hillary Clinton who said in the battle for economic progress, we can't afford to waste one person, we certainly can't afford to waste one gender?
Exactly right.
Yeah. Okay, to Scandinavia. John Frederick, the leader at so many levels in equality for all. Talk to us about the development of that and how it works.
First of all, I feel a little bit disadvantaged being a man discussing this. But let's take the challenge, really. And the reason why I might have been asked and invited to participate here is a bit of the fact that World Economic Forum has done some radar screen activities to the Scandinavian countries in order to try to find out what kind of common denominators would there be that can explain the fact that the Scandinavian countries basically are having a pretty sustainable economic model and have had so for quite a number of decades. So let's embark on the question. I think, first of all, in Norway, I think the first government of Mrs. Brundtland was probably a tone setter for the issue as such. The question is not over in the Scandinavian countries either as to whether there is gender equality or not. But we might say, hopefully, that the Scandinavian countries has brought themselves up that ladder quite significantly by the pretty simple approach to it. There are 50-50 basically out there, men and women. Contributions from both genders, both of them are in the society as equal participants, and when you get access to information and access to education, the participation in the work processes comes easily. And there are plenty of examples. When I went to university mid-70s, only 12% of my fellow students were females at the time. In 2004, 50%, we reached the 50% threshold in business education, which means that throughout that 30 years period, basically, equality has reached the top level of the educational hierarchy. And that means that over time, when this kind of skill set also comes into play in society, equality comes with it. So I think that the central points here is basically respect for the individual, the fact that everyone participates at equal footing, and when you get access to education and information, this gradually comes forward as a natural feature. Then, of course, there is a lot of cultural elements that needs to be addressed as well. And one is, of course, the fact that we men might feel ourselves threatened through our power structures. However, I come to notice that also females have their methods in that play. So, in a way, I've come to understand that since, and we were also working in telecom sector with the Telenor activities, and 50% of our customers are females. And as a consequence, we are gradually building both genders in all layers of the organization. And I wouldn't be surprised if females understands habits of networking, social networking, better than men in many ways. So here we go. I think that is the short story in a summarized way.
Dorstu, I'd like to come back to your point. You made very clearly that the cultural values need to change from the beginning. As a recently elected member of Parliament...
Not from the beginning, that they have to change along with other changes.
Along with other. As a recently elected member of Parliament, obviously a minority party, a small minority party within the Parliament, what do you do now to start pushing for those changes? How do you go about pushing for more equality within Burma?
The problem is that in Burma, a lot of people think that women already have equal rights. Under the law, we have equal rights. And when you go to Burma, you see women taking a very active part in society. You see them engaging in economic activities. So you do not think that women are discriminated against. But as I mentioned to you earlier, way back, a very high colonial administrator said that the future of Burma was in the hands of her women, because he said that they worked so much harder than the men, they were so much more vibrant, they were so much more reliable. And that was 60 years ago, more than 60 years ago, about 70 years ago. And why is it that in spite of the fact that the quality, the ability of Burmese women were recognized so well back, so far back, we are still unable to play the kind of role we should be playing in the political life of our country. In the economic life, yes. There's a cultural attitude which I think is probably shared in other Asian countries. For example, a lot of our domestic workers, the majority of our domestic workers are women, are girls. Some are young girls. They come up from the villages and they work in order to support their siblings back home. Why is it that if there is a boy and a girl in a family capable of going out to do some work, it's a girl who's always sent away to work, to earn for her siblings, for her brothers to go to school? There's still the belief that boys should be favored when it comes to education. It starts there. And I know domestic workers who work very hard in order to send back money to their husbands who stay in their villages and drink. I mean, why is that? I want to know why this is accepted, and why the men are not reluctant to accept such a situation.
In Burma, women hold up more than half the sky. But coming to my point, what do you do now? What, with your newfound political power, if you like, within the system, what do you do?
Well, to begin with, we've adopted a very simple policy of giving women as much responsibility as possible in our party. When we were preparing for the by-elections, it was our policy that we would try to get in as many women candidates as possible. Now, you will ask, well, all right, then why is it that we fielded only 13 out of 44? We found that when we looked around, the women themselves had voluntarily kept back. So they were not in the kind of positions where we could have chosen them as candidates. We had to work very hard. And some of the women we had to persuade to come forward as candidates. And we also found that, especially in the rural areas, the men were not so keen on putting forward women candidates. We tried to make the choosing of our candidates as democratic as possible by asking the townships to nominate their own, our parties, our party officers in the townships to nominate their own candidates. And I have to say, very sadly, that the majority of the nominations were men.
So, yeah. Helene, can I just ask you on this point about starting early, getting women involved, and let's look at education. Do you see a change in your sphere of operations around Asia that, as is happening in Bangladesh, that there is more of an emphasis now on pushing girls into school and keeping them there? Is that sea change starting to happen?
Yeah, I think it's starting to happen, and clearly getting girls educated and including them in education, but not just education, helping them to use that education. And so, you know, a lot of the work that we do focuses not just on how do you make sure girls get in school, but making sure, one, they have access to quality education, two, that they also have opportunities to use that education so that they can learn how to be leaders in their families and their communities. So
that's the key, isn't it? The opportunity. They can get that education, but do they have the opportunity then to
actually use it? And then how do you make sure that families see the value of continuing to keep their girls in school? Because so often, as was said, girls' education is often sacrificed so that their brother can continue to go to school, so that they are asked to raise resources for the family, contribute those resources, but not continue their own education. So really, it's not just making sure that the girl gets to school, that she has the access, has the ability to use that education, but that we're educating families at the same time on what's the value of their girls actually being educated. And you know, it raises the broader point that when we talk about empowering girls and women, it's also about how do you change the thinking around girls and women, and how do you engage boys and men? Because if we don't engage boys and men, then on one hand, you may have changed the way a girl or a woman feels about herself, but you haven't changed the other side of the equation. And sometimes it makes it even harder for a girl who now has a changed sense of herself, but she goes back into a family or a society who hasn't changed. So we work equally on making sure that boys and men are engaged as well and understand why is it important to value the education of their daughters. And men are now starting to be some of the strongest supporters for making sure that their girls get an education because they see the value. They see the difference that it makes in the life of their daughters and in the life of their sons, who are now starting to see women in a very different way.
Rokia, if I could bring you in on this, is that what you're seeing in Bangladesh as well? It is enshrined that girls will have a requisite level of education, but is the society changing enough for it then to be recognised that they have that place within the society as workers?
Yes, changing very positively. I compare myself when I went and joined the bank. My father's friends complained to him, "Why did you let your daughter join the bank?" Today, when a daughter does not work, the father has to explain to his friends why his daughter is not working. It's changed so much.
So where is, because Bangladesh still has, according to the WEF report, it still has a...
Yes, because we inherited a culture where the women were not there, but we're working towards reducing the gender gap. And
Of course you are. And what to you now is the key sticking point in the reduction of that, narrowing that gap?
well, banks, like they prove that they're very sincere and committed workers. So banks, multinationals, whenever they advertise, they're looking for girls. They give girls opportunities, and we have maybe not 50% women in banks, but it's growing every day. They are everywhere, in each branch. In the most remotest places, banks have women working there.
You're sounding very positive.
Yes, I am. Because
What are the negatives? I mean, I'm just curious. It sounds like everything's moving in the right direction, but there must be areas where there is a lag, there are problems. I wonder if it's areas which is common to the rest of the region.
The negatives, I see the positives because we've moved a long way. And borrowings, like previously when a woman wanted to go, urban woman wanted to go and borrow money to put up a business, she was taken as a high risk. But the pressure from the government has been so much to banks to give loans to women that they are getting loans for SMEs. So, and they are supposed to, when they compare with men, they're better borrowers. Their returns are better than the men borrowers. So today, if you ask anybody, they will say the women work better, they're sincere, they're committed, and they're better borrowers. They do better in business.
This is something I have read. One of the problems is access to capital for women. Just that they have the idea they are a good credit risk, but still the access to capital is a problem. Helene, first of all, is that something you see?
Well, yes, and it's something that we're working a lot on, is really making sure that women do have economic opportunities, whether it's through microfinance, and that can be anything from very simple microfinance schemes where women pool resources and save together and then make loans to each other to start small businesses that then generate capital, to including women within the value chain. We're working, for instance, with some large multinationals in countries in Asia who have started recognizing that it's good economic business to begin working more with some of the poor rural communities that they didn't previously have access to, but it's also good social value. So as an example, we're working with Walmart on helping to improve agricultural productivity with women who grow cashews. They're now able to increase their crop yield because they're learning how to manage crops, they're learning how to get better inputs, better, and ultimately have better productivity. Those cashews are now being sold back to Walmart, and they're being able to have a better, more dependable source for sourcing for their products. But it also means that these are poor women who are now developing an income who wouldn't have otherwise. So, I think that more and more the opportunities to also include the private sector as being part of the solution and really helping to make sure that people, poor communities, and particularly women, who are oftentimes the ones who are part of the more likely to be rural workers, part of the small farmers in many of the countries here. And so making sure that they're included, it increases their economic productivity. They're able to send their children to school. They're able to make upgrades in their household, but it's also good for business. So I think there are increasingly these win-win situations that are possible, but it does mean that there has to be an eye towards making sure that the social good and the social investment is very much a part of it as well.
John Frederick, if I could bring you in, just if you could just speak to the impact that mobile telephony has had on this topic and on the development of the rural areas, because obviously it has, well, you will be told, it is a game changer in so many ways. Does that include, how is it helping women in the rural community access to all sorts of things?
Now, first, if you allow me, I think to the bigger question that you raised initially to this round, I think this is a question of attitude. Then we're talking culture, then we're talking sort of how people view things. Aung San Suu Kyi this morning said there needs to be a commitment. And if there is a kind of commitment here with sort of having a target in mind, namely that of inclusion, and namely that of participation for everyone. And then, if you then add the government's willingness then to step forward and say, here is some legislation which puts up the support for the long-term building of attitudes, that is at least one way that this question has been addressed in Scandinavia, because Norway was the first country probably that legislated participation of females at corporate boards. Not without debate and disagreements and agreements on both sides of the table, but after it has been there for some years, it's not questioned anymore. It comes natural. Then on the micro level that you asked, does mobile telephony helps? Well, we in the mobile telecommunication industry, we say that mobile telephony, that solves everything. Everything from financial services to health, but of course it doesn't solve, but it contributes. And in Bangladesh in particular, the village lady phone concept is a very famous, world-known example, where mobile phone, also financed through a microcredit kind of system, has created wealth at micro level with extraordinary importance for those people that got on board early. I think we can solidly sort of stamp that one. And I experienced it myself. I was in a village in Bangladesh. We have been in Grameenphone for 15 years, running the company from 0 to now over 30 million customers. And we were in a village some years ago, and mobile coverage had come to the village, and then there were 3 phones in the village. And I used my Norwegian phone and called to a local phone in Bangladesh, which was at the time quite a good experience. Then the village lady came over to me afterward, and then she said, "Mr. Baksos, please make sure that there will be no more phones in my village." She had immediately understood the value of that phone in her pocket. She became the hub of every information and all connectivity between village members. And of course, I couldn't promise her that. Meaning that her being an entrepreneur on the issue got a phenomenal start. And she said, "My kids are going to school. My kids are going to get the best education in this country, and I'm going to safeguard their future with this phone." So the phenomenal empowerment of being included is such a strong driving force, and I think we have numerous of examples, not only the one I referred to in Bangladesh, there are plenty others as well. Also here in Thailand, examples are plentiful.
Mm-hmm.
Rocky.
Yes, in Bangladesh, the mobile has really, it's like a revolution. In the rural areas, we have given mobiles to women. They have borrowed the money and they pay back in installments. and they call mobile ladies. And we have a lot of overseas workers abroad, Japan, Malaysia, and other countries, and they call their families. So they call this mobile lady and say that I'm going to call at this time, and then she informs the person, and he is there for the call, and she gets her money for that. So it's an income for her.
Just remind us, so with this sort of micro lending and this mobile lending, the interest rates that are charged are still quite high, aren't they?
Well, it has to be high because it is not the normal bank where you go to a bank. The banker just sits in a room and the customer comes to him. Here, the bank goes to the customer. So we have to have a lot of field officers operating in the villages. They go right to the villages, they go to they have centers, and the women don't have to go to the bank. The bank goes to the women.
And what would an average interest rate be?
It could come up to something like 20%.
Right. And what is the average default
But
rate on that?
it is not too much, because if this interest rate was not available to them, the local lender would give them at something like 80 to 100%. So when they get a 20%, it is very reasonable compared to the money lender there.
Dorsu, can I ask you that in your speech this morning you were talking about investment coming into your country, but you wanted everyone to share. It wasn't just for the investor, it wasn't just for special interest groups within the community. What responsibility do companies have, would you like to see companies have, who come to Burma to give back to the community? Corporate social responsibility, many people would call it. It is a new, emerging, a pioneer, a frontier market. What would you expect them to give back in terms of helping the community at the lowest level, at the bottom?
Are we talking about women and girls in particular?
We are talking about women and girls, but let's start generally and then...
Well, as I said earlier, job creation and education at the same time. You have to be able to train those people to take up the jobs that you're going to provide for them. This has to go in tandem, go hand in hand. And I've been listening to the increasing economic participation of women. I believe in increasing the economic participation of women, but I want to make sure, because we're talking about jobs, I want to make sure that this economic participation is reflected in their political and social status. Now, what I want to say is that I want to distinguish the nurturing role of women from the sacrificial role. And I think this is a cultural issue. Now, I say this because I went to an HIV/AIDS prevention center, and there, this is some years back, and I met a number of commercial sex workers. I talked to them, and I talked to the people working in the center, and they told me that 80% of the CSWs were supporting their parents and siblings. The girls were going out to work as commercial sex workers in order to support their siblings. Why not the boys? What were the boys doing? And the sad thing was some of the parents knew, but they pretended not to know. So that I see as a sacrificial role, not as a nurturing role. The nurturing role of women is what makes them so responsible with regard to microcredit, why they are the ones who make microcredit work. And I agree with that. I take pride in that. But the sacrificial role, no, that has to stop. That is a cultural issue. This is what I mean by saying that cultural issues must be addressed at the same time as economic, social, political issues. Girls and women must not be expected to make sacrifices for their families when the boys and men are not expected to do so.
Please.
The negative that you asked me, the only negative I can see is that women have to take a double load. You see, they look after the family, they look after the household, and they have to do the income, whereas men take just the single load. That's the negative.
Elaine, would you like to? Oh, sorry.
To your question on how can companies like ours contribute, and how should we contribute? First of all, the telecom sector basically is a sector that needs a pretty significant investment up front until you can say that you create a market. Usually it takes between 3 to 5 years before you can say you break even on your operating cost up against your revenues. Meaning that if you shall get such an infrastructure in place, governments needs to put up a regulatory framework that is fairly stable and gives predictability. Then, on the other side of the coin, what is being then generated in such a period? Well, that's a whole marketplace. It's a new ecosystem. It builds competences and it employs a lot of people, both in building the network and distributing the services and serving your customers on the way. So the employment effect from this kind of infrastructure investment is quite significant in any society. When this industry has moved from the investment phase into the profitability phase, these companies become taxpayers. They become contributors to other functions in the society on top of being just infrastructure builders. Being so important to individuals, you direct your services to the whole of the society, men, women, corporates, individuals. And in that sense, if you don't deliver your services in tune with the demand of your customers longer term, you're out of business. And that of course is a dynamic situation. And the storyline on regulation from country to country is a thick book, which I don't want to address here. But the overall principle is if the predictability is there, investment will come and employment will go along with it.
I just want to ask you, as a Scandinavian company, when you invest in these emerging markets, do you look at positive discrimination for women in your workforce, in your labour force in those countries, as a way of redressing the balance? Should you?
I think yes and no, because yes to the extent that the Scandinavian attitude, where inclusion is sort of part of our genes, will not put up discrimination. But I also think we have to be frank enough to say that are we good enough to really do that? Here in Thailand, our company DTAC has roughly 50% females already. And what is that an expression of? Well, it's an expression of that females contribute in our value chain as good as anyone else.
Helene, should there be affirmative action?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to not be exploitive. And in many situations, we can see women workers being exploited in the workplace. And so, I think there are ways in which companies, again, to your basic point, that can be positive, can create positive social change in the way, and positive social value in the way they work. I'll give an example of our work with GAP in factory workers, for example. We're working in 4 countries here in Asia: Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Bangladesh, working with women factory workers who were previously only kept at the very lowest rungs of the ladder, never were able to get promoted to managers, often taken advantage of by their male managers. But what we've been able to do is to work with women in those factory situations, provide them education, provide them information about basic health and hygiene. Many of them had absenteeism just because of basic health and hygiene situations. So giving them numeracy, literacy. Now, because they have the power of education and information, these same women who were locked in these lower rung factory jobs have now started becoming managers. They're now earning better income, sending their children to school. The program also educates children in the community. So I think there are ways in which companies can actually be responsible And at the same time, it's good for their business.
And what
but they
happens-
also can be responsible in the way they go about making sure that they're not exploiting and that they're giving back to the communities in which they work.
And what happens when those women start families? I'll give you a statistical example of Japan. 75% of Japanese women leave work after their first child because they believe it is a choice. It's a clear choice between work and caring for the family. It was suggested that there needs to be so much more flexibility within the corporate structures. Are you seeing that? Do you support that? Is that becoming more
Definitely, and I think as more and more women enter the workplace, we have to make sure we're not putting a double burden on them. That we're looking at what are the holistic needs that women have. Is it childcare? Is it flexible hours? Making sure that there's safety so that women who have to travel distances to get to work don't have to have insecure situations. So I think it's looking at it in a holistic way.
And what's the uptake on that from corporations?
Well, I think it varies. You know, it varies a lot. But I think it's why we have to hold corporations accountable and make sure that they recognize that if they're going to be working in emerging markets, that there is a responsibility to the communities in which they're working.
John Frederick, do you have that sort of flexibility in your workforce to make sure that women can stay in the job, in the labour market, and still have families?
In Scandinavia, this is legislated. So the welfare state definition in Scandinavia put a lot of emphasis on this part. And legislation in many other countries can go a long way. But on the other hand, do we do it? Yes, we do it, but not to the same extent that is being done in Scandinavia. I think we have to be fair saying that. But the flexibility on this and the respect for this is embedded in our culture. And the power of being included is very, very strong for everyone. And we were earlier in the discussion on the education and access to information. And if you take an example in this room right now, despite us being good entertainers in a debate, I'm pretty sure that we are in competition with you guys checking out your email or your SMS. Meaning that if we had taken the mobile phone off you, when you come in here, we will felt lost. In a sense, the power of being included is strong for us as a community, as a privileged part of the population. But that means that the same power and the same empowerment is applicable for everyone when the difference is being included or not included. And if you apply that up to your very question, then you have a pretty strong formula.
We have some questions from social media to ask the panel as well, and also questions from the floor. Just before we do that, I'd just like to pick up that point about sort of affirmative action within the corporate front and apply that and get the panel's thoughts on should that also apply on the political spectrum. Dorsu, perhaps I can ask you, should there be quotas, if you like, on selection on candidates for Parliament?
I think there should be, just to help the process make a jump start. Because our women are capable of taking part in the political process. We have just not been given the opportunity to do so.
Rokia.
Yes, I think they should, because politics and women in parliament, that's the highest policy-making body. In Bangladesh, we used to have reserved seats, and we've increased that. We have 5 women ministers in important positions like Ministry of Home, Foreign Affairs, Agriculture, Labor, and Women's Affairs. We have a Ministry of Women's Affairs.
Is it clear to you that the strong level of women participation at senior levels in government has had a very positive knock-on effect to the education, to the development of girls and women in the community at large?
Well, it at least shows that they can go into politics. They can show a woman leader.
It's a role model.
Yes, as a role model. And the women ministers, especially the Prime Minister being there, the men are listening to the Prime Minister. So.
Helene.
Yeah, I think definitely, you know, and I'd like to start with my own country, where we have a very low rate of women in political leadership. It's getting better, but you know, if you look at parliaments as an example around the world, I think the average is about 19% female parliamentarians around the world. The Scandinavians are up to about 40%, highest in the world, and it's partly because they started by having these quotas. And, you know, I think my country is about 14, 15%. One of our former congresswomen sitting here today, and I'm sure she would attest to the fact that it was very lonely there, not having women who could, you know, have a critical mass of women who I think does shift the discussion, shift the kinds of policies that are passed. You know, and there's a lot of data that have shown that if you have about 30% is kind of this tipping point, whether it's in businesses, you know, the 30% of women on corporate boards or 30% of women in legislatures or on the cabinet, there's this tipping point that by having this critical mass, you really do have a different dialogue, you have different kinds of policies, and so I think it is core. And the only way that I think, you know, many places are going to start that and to jumpstart that is to have some kind of fixed percentage. And, you know, ultimately it won't be necessary. But to get it started, you know, I think that's the only way to do it. And countries like, again, like Norway that led the way show that by setting those quotas, you really then do have those knock-on effects.
A very short comment on that. I think we're back to education again. If the education broadens to everyone, boy and girl, and Aung San Suu Kyi in her speech this morning said, we need to put emphasis on elementary school. We have that, but we will want to push the bigger gravitation around the secondary school. And if you, and I guess that goes for both genders. And if you take that to the very top of the educational hierarchy, then it's inevitable. Behind that, you will get a broader critical mass to choose from. So if education, and it becomes normal to get to the educational level for everyone, then this will pour down and ripple into organizations and functions in the society as well. That's my belief.
If you propose that, Dorsu, to the Parliament, a quota, what do you think the reaction would be?
Well, I don't know what the 500 and something men would think about that. I don't think all of them would be enthusiastic, but I think we've got to try to push forward the political and social power of women. We have to do that because we have found that women are, shall we say, more responsible members of society.
I want to ask the panel a question. This is a question from a Twitter feed here at the WEF, and it's a question for the whole panel. I guess your answer depends very much on where the countries are on the economic scale. But the question is, how important is higher education as a priority for East Asia in developing the role of women? And I know, Dorsu, you spoke this morning about the need for secondary education, vocational training. If we could just pick it up there, tertiary education, higher education, how important?
It's important because it's a psychological thing. In a country, if there are very well-educated women, then I think people start respecting women more. So we are capable of it too. As I said earlier, our best students are girls. At university entrance exams, they do better than boys. But they try to equalize the situation by discriminating against girls, requiring them to get higher marks. But if we could show that the majority of that many of our best educated people are women, that would give a boost to the role of women. That would help to change our cultural values in the right direction.
How would you describe the level of education or the quality of education in Myanmar now?
Oh, very poor. I thought you knew that.
Well, I will accept that. We're very poor. I'm thrown. Is there a tertiary, or is there a tertiary education out there which you would which people would actually learn the skill set, enough of the skill set to actually function at a higher level educationally in Myanmar now? Or do you have to start, you have to really start again the whole system to build it up?
Well, we have to change the whole system, but I don't think that the situation of our tertiary education is any worse than that of our elementary education. The whole system has to be reformed. It has to be improved. I think there's too much emphasis, as I said earlier, on higher education because I think the government is probably thinking in terms of national prestige, to be able to produce many PhDs. But I'm thinking in terms of national workability. So while when it comes to gender, I would like to see more girls getting higher degrees just to make a cultural impact, if you like. At the basic level, I think we all need better education.
Rokia, how important is higher education now in
higher
Bangladesh?
education, I agree, is in Bangladesh, I see it as an elitist. The elite, the rich families go in for higher education. For the masses, it has to be secondary education and skill training. We have a problem where we have free education up to grade 12. We see that by grade 9 and 10, there's a big dropout. And they drop out to get married because security becomes a problem in rural Bangladesh, or maybe they get married early. So there is a big, and that's where they're encouraging these girls who drop out from 9 and 10 to go into self-employment, get training, and get self-employed.
Elaine?
Yeah, well, I think it's not an either-or situation. If you think about what education is for, it's to meet the needs of a given country. So, I would, maybe use the analogy, my background is in health, and, I used to visit countries, emerging and developing countries, where you would go and there would be many, many fancy CAT scans throughout the country, but children were going unvaccinated. It's the same sort of thing with higher education. And people wanted to get CAT scans because that made them feel, it was the prestige aspect again, made countries feel we can get the newest, the fanciest equipment. But at the same time, children were dying from access to clean, safe drinking water and vaccination. So in the same way, what are the needs of the country? If, in fact, most of your children don't have access to basic education, that's going to be where you start. Yes, it's important to have some access to tertiary education, but is that one university or is it 10? Are your basic needs getting met? Are your vocational needs? Are the needs for the skills that are most important for development of your country, are those first met? So I think it's not an either or. Tertiary education is, of course, important. It's important to have highly skilled workers and educated people within any country, but it has to be that balance and making sure that the real focus for what the education is needed for is kept in mind.
And in any case, you can't get a PhD unless you've completed your elementary schooling,
right.
At least.
And then go on to secondary school. And, yeah, so it's looking at it in a much more holistic way.
Okay, we only have about 10 minutes left, so I would like to open this up to the floor. Please, there are microphones roving. If you could just state your name and your affiliation. Sir, if you could stand up, hand in the air. Yes.
Khalid Janahi from Vision 3. As a man in this audience, I feel, I'm going to take a few words of what you had this morning, I feel actually recklessly pessimistic from a man's perspective. In the near future, the gender gap is going to be the other way around rather than the way it is with these ladies around. So it's very, very optimistic the way things are going forward. I come from a small country, which is Bahrain. We have over 300 entities as financial services registered there. Over 55% of the workforce are women. Less than 10 are CEOs of those institutions. So that shows something of an issue that is there. My question is, I mean, you've raised it, Andrew, but you were thrown out on that question, but let me raise it again. The issue of, I don't believe that, and I'm putting it to the panel, I don't believe that regulation or affirmative action is the way forward to what you mentioned about issue of culture. Culture change is not going to come through regulation, it's not going to come through affirmative action. It's change of the mindset. The mindset has to change. Something else you said this morning, that you learn the sense of duty from your mother. We're all, whether we like it or not, in our DNA, we are closer to our mothers than we are to our fathers. This is a reality which is there on the ground. So where is the change in the culture going to come from? It has to come from home, it has to come from us. So how are we going to go forward on that without actually using regulation and affirmative action? Thank you.
Thank you.
I think incentives can help to change the mindset. In the east of Burma, where we have Muslims in the Rakhine state, I believe the World Food Programme ran a project whereby it was rice for sending girls to school. And it did work to a certain extent, because they wanted the rice, and they could get the rice only if they sent their daughters to school. They did send their daughters to school. So I think cultural changes can be brought about through incentives. Not completely, they can't be changed completely, but incentives do help. And when I talked about positive discriminations, I said earlier that what we needed was a jump start, and a jump start helps. And after that, we can gain our own momentum. So I agree with you that these positive discrimination measures will not bring about a complete change in our cultural attitudes, but it will help to bring about changes in the cultural attitudes.
Lady in the front here.
Thank you very much. My name is Erin. First, I want to say that my heart has been racing all morning because I wanted to address you, and I'm so happy and feel so fortunate to have this opportunity, as I'm sure as many, many millions of other women around the world feel the same way. So, and I'm Vietnamese American, and I come from a family that has 12 siblings, 6 boys, 6 girls, so I can tell you that, that you know, my experiences and you know, growing up at home, and you know, even though we moved to the U.S. from Vietnam, we still you know, had a very traditional upbringing. And you know, the fact that you said this morning that empowerment, and this is what this panel is about, empowerment comes from the home, and empowerment comes from the sense of duty, and that is extremely true in the Southeast Asian context and in my family's context in particular. And certainly when you go outside of the home, you then look for some other ways to, as a woman, to reinforce that empowerment. So you look for role models such as yourself, you know, who you've really shown me and people of my generation, I believe, that it's okay to win by having steel fists and velvet gloves. You know, that's how we see you, that you've instilled that hope in us. So as we move forward and addressing that gap that we've discussed here at the panel, where it is addressed at home. It is really, you know, how my mother viewed my brothers, my 6 brothers versus her 6 other daughters. You know, nowadays when we look at technology empowering, allowing us to have access to information, and the internet and social media, I wonder if that's factored into the thinking of the distinguished panel, is how that could actually be a source of empowerment for women. Thank you.
Hélène, the social media.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is, and I think of a few conversations that I've had recently in countries where there is a big gender gap, in conversations with men who have said, you know, the fact that our women have access to information today because of the internet and because of the connectivity that the world now has, we know that things are going to be different, because once you get information, information is power, and it does change the way you think about yourself. It changes the way, what you believe is possible. So I think that this ever-connected world, and after all, that's the theme of this conference, I think is really a tool for empowerment, as women and men have access to information in ways that they never had before. I think it does just then start breaking down barriers in ways that I think will have, you know, real powerful impact.
Earlier, I was asked by our moderator how I managed to keep in touch with what was happening in the world when I was under house arrest. And I explained that I listened to the radio about 5 to 6 hours a day. And that kept me in touch with the outside world. And actually, I learned some things from the radio that I might not have learned looking at people or speaking to people face to face, because there are too many distractions there. You may be distracted by a smile or just by the food that's on the table. But when you're listening to somebody speaking on the radio, you've got nothing to distract you. You do listen, and you acquire the kind of information that otherwise you might not have been able to get. So information is empowerment.
We'll look forward to your Twitter account. Questions? Sir, in the front row here.
Thank you very much. I'm Jeff Lipman. I'm a member of the Global Agenda Council on Aviation, Travel and Tourism. And I have a question for Aung San Suu Kyi around our sector, tourism, because it's going to be a very important element of the transformation that hopefully is going to happen to your country. And if we do it in a traditional fashion, we employ a lot of women in our sector, but they don't necessarily get the best jobs or the best paying jobs. And my question to you is, if you had a wish as to how tourism could affect that transformation to meet the ideals that you've expressed this morning, what should we do now rather than afterwards when the opening up has occurred? Thank you.
I have been discussing the possibility of vocational training linked to tourism, because there is going to be a tremendous flood of tourists, and we do not have the facilities to cope with all this. And if we were able to set up the kind of training programs that would provide the tourist industry with the workers they need in hotels, as guides, in restaurants, I think then you would be helping our economy to go forward in a very acceptable way, because in a hotel, for example, you have many kinds of employees, from the chef to the bellboy to the receptionist, so you can work at different levels. And I understand that in Burma now there are private training programs where they train people to work in the tourist industry within 2 or 3 months. So short courses can give people a start in some job that will also give them an opening into higher level employment. So I think that you could help, not just by sending tourists to Burma, but making sure that there are the right kind of facilities to receive these tourists.
So certainly the service sector generally in Asia Pacific is booming, and the statistics show that the number of people who will be required is enormous, which it does represent a huge job opportunity for not just women, but for all. But certainly that is a sector. There was a question down here at the front, madam.
Thank you. Melody Meyer, I'm president of Chevron Asia Pacific, and as an engineer, and more importantly, in an industry and a company that hires science, technology, engineering, math students, do you have any thoughts, any of the panelists, about how we can encourage girls to stay with it when it comes to engineering, science, and math, because of the really terrific and rewarding careers that are out there for women and men, but particularly women that don't stay with it in STEM careers? Any thoughts about the importance or how to encourage women to stay with it?
Yes, the question is how to keep women in engineering, in the sciences, to keep the women in those areas? How do you go about it? How do you keep it?
They turn off normally, usually in secondary school, and don't stay with science, technology, engineering, and math. And any thoughts about the importance to encourage that?
One thing, they need to see more people who look like you. You know, I think it is, you know, role models. I think you can't underestimate the value of having role models. And so I think seeing somebody like yourself and understanding that it is possible for a woman to be an engineer and to, you know, have a high position in a company like that. And so, you know, I just think we have to have more role models and make those role models visible. Also making sure that in the educational system, we're not doing those sending those unintended messages, because I think that's what happens is, you know, girls get the unintended message that that's for boys, that those are things that boys do, and I think we've got to be more affirmative, again, in the way that we view education for girls, and having them see the link between what's the practical reality of being a scientist and then having a job as an engineer, and what does that mean, and giving them tangible evidence of that, and really working with families. Again, I think making sure that families recognize the importance of having their girls get an education. But, you know, again, I think the role models play such an important role.
I think we need more stories about engineer heroines, because I remember that when I read the biography of Marie Curie, I wish that I had taken up chemistry.
Okay, we will have to leave it there on that note. We've run over time just a little bit, but if you'll join me, please, in thanking our very distinguished panel for their time.